All right, welcome, good afternoon, and welcome to our discussion on artificial intelligence and ethics featuring Professor Casey Fiesler. I'm Harry Certain. I'm a professor at the law school here and also director of the Silicon Flatirons Artificial Intelligence, or AI, initiative. This is the first on a multi-lecture series at the intersection of artificial intelligence and ethics, supported by the Daniels Fund and Silicon Flatirons. And I think what's particularly interesting about this topic is that it blends one of humanity's oldest subjects, ethics, with one of its newest subjects, artificial intelligence. So ethics is one of the oldest topics for humanity. Guidelines about how to treat your friends, your family, strangers, and society go back to the dawn of recorded history and probably before. Artificial intelligence, on the other hand, is a relatively new endeavor, one of humanity's newest developments, and AI, there's no agreed upon definition of AI. So one of the features of AI is that it involves programming computer systems that make decisions or predictions or actions that approximate that which would involve a similarly situated person of intelligence. So that doesn't fully cover it, what AI is, and people would disagree, but that's the approximate aspect of it. So in this talk, we have the old and the new mixed together. And I think that's really very interesting. One thing to make clear, I always like to make clear at talks like this, is that artificial intelligence is not what the media or science fiction leads you to believe. So in the media, we sometimes see depictions of strong artificial intelligence, also known as artificial general intelligence. That's computers that think, that can engage in abstract reasoning, think to that level that meets or surpasses humans. You often see that in the media discussing as if that's here or just around the corner. I study this for a living. My opinion, there's no evidence that we're even close to that, and we may never get there, and about half of AI researchers think we might never get there. At the minimum, it's not here today, and it's not going to be here in the next 5 years. But that being said, AI is capable of amazing things, creating art, creating music, engaging in writing of text. It's just not that. Before introducing our superstar speaker, Professor Casey Fiesler, let me thank those who helped make today's lecture and lecture series possible. First, I would like to thank the amazing Margot Kaminsky, professor here at the law school, who not only was the chief organizer and brainchild behind this AI and ethics series and worked so hard to make this happen, but will also be our next speaker in the series on November 16th. So please come to her talk on that. I would also like to thank the law school's tremendous Melanie Kay and the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative for their incredible support for today's lecture series, without who this would not be possible. Also, I'd like to thank the Silicon Flatirons Center, the co-sponsor of this event, whose amazing staff were instrumental in making this happen. Finally, I'd like to thank the Dean of the Law School and the amazing law school staff who, faculty and staff who came together and made this happen. All right, and without further ado, let me introduce our superstar speaker, Professor Casey Fiesler. Casey is an associate professor in CU's Department of Information Science. And Professor Fiesler is the epitome of interdisciplinarity, the combination of different subjects of study. She not only has a PhD in human-centered computing from Georgia Tech, she also has a law degree from Vanderbilt University. Professor Fiesler is widely admired as a scholar and a teacher, and has published quite a bit in the field of technology ethics and law and online communities. And then even more interesting, and not something I usually get to say for a professor, Professor Fiesler is also a TikTok star with over 100,000 followers. So she's a TikTok influencer, which is pretty impressive. So she's really the perfect person to talk about the intersection of artificial intelligence and ethics, and we're so fortunate to have her here at CU today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Casey Fiesler.
Hello, I am very excited to be here to kick off the speaker series, and there are some amazing people coming as well, Mario later in the next semester, so I hope people will continue to come to these. I am a technology optimist. This sometimes comes as a surprise to people because I also tend to be the buzzkill ethicist / lawyer in the room. But interestingly, for me, part of being an optimist is that I make slides that look like this over and over until I retire. Because I think that if we want technology like AI to do good for the world, to be the best that it can possibly be, it is incredibly important that we have foresight about potential harms, and also that we learn from the past, like these kinds of controversies. And probably a number of those that were flashing across the screen you recognized. One of those is this one that probably a lot of people have heard about. So a few years ago, a Black man was wrongfully arrested due to an error with facial recognition. And this should have come as no surprise, no surprise at all. I find it highly unlikely that this is the first time that this happened. However, it got a lot of media attention, and the reason that we should not be surprised that this happened is because we knew about exactly these kinds of errors in facial recognition. Even before Joy Buolamwini's work, we had been hearing about racial bias in facial recognition since the early 2000s. So of course this was going to happen. And if you backed up, say, 10 years, add, some dramatic effect, and this absolutely could have been a pitch for a Black Mirror episode. These kinds of things that happen over and over again, and we think, well, shouldn't we have known that would happen? Often the answer is yes. And sometimes it's because we know about the potential flaws in technology, and sometimes it's because we know about the flaws in humans. So for example, decades of resume audit studies tell us that humans are racist when they evaluate resumes. And they're also sexist. Things like names influence whether you put someone into the to hire pile or the not to hire pile. And so if you are going to train AI on a to hire pile and a not to hire pile, then of course you're going to end up with biased results. And the other thing that we can always be assured of when it comes to any kind of technology is that people are terrible. There are awful people in the world who will always use every tool at their disposal to be the most awful possible. And so, of course, technology like deepfakes have been used for harassment and revenge porn and all kinds of terrible things. And this should not surprise us. So why can't we prepare for it? This is not an AI-related example, but something that you probably heard of was Zoom bombing. So at the beginning of the pandemic, when people were able to use, the random 8-digit numbers that Zoom rooms were using, or search for public Zoom rooms on social media, and go into random meetings and yell racial slurs or show people their genitals, or generally just be awful. Should not have come as a surprise. I have to say, it did not come as a surprise to me. It did, however, come as a surprise to the CEO of Zoom, who gave this interview to the New York Times and said, oh, well, we never thought about that. Hindsight is 20/20, of course. But I think at some point, perhaps we could have thought about that. And there are lots of examples of this kind of thing. As I said, are there ways that we can learn from the past? Are there things that we should have seen coming? Are there things that we did see coming, but it didn't necessarily matter? Another controversy you might have heard about when it comes to predictive machine learning, Cambridge Analytica. Did you know that you can predict very personal traits from Facebook likes, such that you can determine something like whether someone's an introvert or an extrovert based on their Facebook patterns, and then maybe, I don't know, show them the political ad that would appeal more to an introvert or an extrovert? How could we have possibly known that that was something that could happen? In 2014, researchers published about this and said at the time, there are considerable negative implications of the fact that this is true. And sometimes this kind of research is actually the start of something, right? Sometimes we start with AI research where we want to know whether something is possible without necessarily thinking about what would happen if it was possible. For example, being able to infer personal traits from someone's face, or not even infer a personal trait, but something that is arguably not possible at all, criminality. Can we infer trustworthiness? Can we infer political orientation? Maybe. Criminality, no, because what you're actually measuring is whether someone is arrested or not. But in these cases, it's often described as, well, it's for science, right? Can we do this? Except it never stops at science, right? And these kinds of things can make their way into the real world because that's what science is for. And in part because of this, in part because of the potential implications of this kind of research, the AI conference NeurIPS has started requiring broader impact statements for papers that are published there. And I can tell you that this had a pretty significant amount of pushback. Not from everyone, of course, some very loud voices. But part of the pushback to this is, well, how do you expect me to see the future? And this is something that people have said explicitly to me. And some of the sort of buzzwords in this conversation have been around unintended or unanticipated consequences. That's not what I built this for. I didn't build Zoom for people to show other people their genitals. But we know that this is a problem, right? So if you're thinking about unanticipated consequences, things that you don't know are going to go wrong, we look back to sociologist Robert Burton, decades and decades ago, talked about two major problems that influence unintended consequences. So one is incomplete analysis because of uncertainty. And uncertainty is a very common side effect of technological revolutions. Like, this is just what happens. And another problem that results in unanticipated consequences is errors that result from assuming functional equivalence. So because something was like this in the past, perhaps something will be like this in the future. And when I was thinking about this as a problem when it comes to emerging technology, it really brought me back. It brought me back to law school. And I'm guessing that many of you have had experiences with law school exams. One of the things that they tell you is that a thing that you're learning to do in law school is think like a lawyer. And when I was getting my PhD, and people would ask me about my experiences in law school and how is this influencing your PhD now and how is it influencing all this work that you're doing that has nothing to do with the law most of the time, I said, well, I don't know that anything that I learned in law school is like, in terms of the content, is particularly influencing what I'm doing now, but it did teach me to think like a lawyer. And one of the things that it taught me especially was issue spotting. So for example, my 2-page long torts exam fact pattern that I still remember was about like a plane crash and like the pilot was dating the flight attendant and someone was drinking and there was bad lighting. Anyway, it was very, very long. And then at the end it just said, discuss all possible torts claims. So I can tell you that this is not a particular kind of skill that is necessarily cultivated in context beyond law school, but it's a very useful one. Being able to see a fact pattern, like here's an AI system and how it works, and spot the issues. Similarly, law school teaches you in part how to think with analogies. And this also becomes important when it comes to emerging technology. When it comes to the law, is an email more like a postcard or a sign or a sealed letter, for example. But when we're thinking about this in the context of technologists, these are not necessarily skills that we are cultivating, and a very common complaint around this process was, how am I supposed to know how to do this? There were a number of papers written after this started, sometimes some with people analyzing these impact statements from papers, and also talking to people about this process. This was from a survey paper, and one of the things that really stuck out at me was that they said respondents said they did not feel qualified to address the broader impacts of their work. And one of my reactions to this was, gosh, well, if you're not, who is, right? And this is not a talk about ethics education. That is a different soapbox that I could stand on very easily for half an hour. But I do have a lot of conversations with computer scientists about how we teach ethics. And a lot of the times the pushback I get is like, I don't know enough about ethics to teach it. And I'm like, I'm not telling you have to read Kant. I'm saying that if you are a machine learning researcher or instructor, I just want you to learn enough about machine learning ethics to teach it to undergrads. So can you learn enough about the thing that you're doing? You should be the most qualified person to think through broader impacts. But we're not necessarily taught how to do this. We don't necessarily have a lot of practice doing this. We do have lots of practice, like thinking through lots of other kinds of problems in technology design and computer science, and in particular looking for bugs and that sort of thing. And in fact, there's a term for a particular type of this, technical debt. This implied cost of future bug fixes caused by choosing a faster solution now instead of an approach that might take longer, like lots of bug fixing. Because you gotta move fast and break things. And maybe you launch your website and the submit button doesn't work, but someone will tell you the submit button doesn't work and then you can fix it. And you know that's gonna be harder to do then than it would be now, but that's where the debt comes in. So in my research lab, we've been talking about the concept of ethical debt, which is the same kind of thing, this future cost of not considering the social and ethical implications or harms now, assuming you can fix them later. And myself and one of my former graduate students, Natalie Garrett, wrote an op-ed about this a couple of years ago, using Zoom bombing as an example, actually. The problem here is that when it's this kind of harm, it's already, like the harm is already done. The submit button doesn't work is a very different kind of bug than, oops, my social media platform undermined democracy. It's too late, right? So we need to learn how to think about these things now so that we can take measures to mitigate harm before it happens. And you might be thinking again, as some people have said to me, well, how am I supposed to see the future? This sounds like science fiction. And it does sound a little bit like science fiction. Isaac Asimov once said that science fiction writers foresee the inevitable. And though problems and catastrophes may be inevitable, solutions are not, which is true. It doesn't tend to be the job of science fiction writers to come up with the solutions, though. But it is the job of a lot of people in this room. It's technologists, sometimes it's regulators. So how can we think a little more like science fiction writers? And a little more like lawyers for the people who aren't. So science fiction is often really good, though, thinking about like our current technological anxieties and imagining the things that might go wrong. So for example, Black Mirror. Very based on current technological fears and pushing them just a little bit farther. And I started to notice the students in my class got really, really excited about talking about Black Mirror. And I was like, if you can get really into thinking about the ethical implications of some technology someone might create in 100 years, why can't you do the same thing with the technology that you're going to create tomorrow? It's the same skill, right? So I thought this would be a good way to cultivate that skill. So I started doing a teaching exercise I called the Black Mirror Writer's Room. And a few years ago, I wrote about it online and put a slide deck online, and now lots and lots of people have done this. I've even gotten like random comments in my TikTok saying, we did the Black Mirror thing in my class at some other university. And so in this exercise, students take a current technology, think about where it might be in the future, and imagine what might go wrong. So for example, this is one from a class in which the students imagined a world in which textbooks are personalized to you in the same way that social media feeds are. Because we've been talking about social media personalization, and apparently one of the students had also been talking to someone about how history is taught slightly differently in different parts of the United States. A recent one from the summer, a group of graduate student computational social scientists came up with this episode they titled Art Models, in which the idea was that in the future, there are no more artists, just AI models creating art, and the job of artists, human artists, is now to sit in warehouses and make art to be used as training data. And this happened to happen like a couple of months before the conversation about AI-generated art exploded. I'm sure that most of you in this room have heard a little bit about it, and if you haven't, you will very, very soon. Some of you might have even seen this image, which is famous now because here in Colorado, someone won an art contest at a fair with this piece of art that was generated by Midjourney. And then tweaked. So Midjourney is one of the AI-generated art systems. And people were unhappy. A lot of people were unhappy about this. A lot of people thought it was cool, but it also definitely has like put some fire on the conversation around like, oh my God, there's not gonna be any more artists anymore. Which was basically the Black Mirror idea, right? And for those of you who are IT people, you're gonna be hearing a lot about this. All of these headlines are from the last month, maybe 2 months. The conversation about copyright and AI-generated art is really, really kicking off. And I've had a lot of fun playing with both Midjourney and DALL-E, which is OpenAI's AI art generating system. And for those of you who are copyright folks, actually, one of the very first things that I created was this. I told DALL-E to give me a cartoon of Mickey Mouse looking angry, standing in an art gallery of unauthorized photos of Mickey Mouse. So this is the kind of thing that you can do there. But also because I'm me, the next thing that I did was a bunch of bias auditing. So for example, this is Midjourney. I asked it for digital art of a computer science professor lecturing to a group of excited students. And we have 3 white men and 1 bald white man lecturing to a room of bald white men. And then I did the same thing on DALL-E. So here you can see also a lot of white men, and also professor. I mean, so, for those of you who have read Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Repression, or heard about this, I used to have a slide that showed Google image results for professor, and it's all white men with beards. But here you can see, we also have a couple of men of color and a Black woman. This is very different than Midjourney, which would give me white men over and over and over again. And I'm going to tell you why, which includes, in fact, why I also got this image when asking DALL-E for a computer science professor. So on the left here, I have DALL-E ask for a scientist, and on the right, I have an ask for scientist holding a sign that says. What's happening here, and the reason I knew to try this was because of someone on Twitter, is that DALL-E is appending demographic features onto the end of a subset of search results. So one of these search results, I'll let you guess which one, actually says a scientist holding a sign that says female. And OpenAI has said that they do this. So this is a technique that they're using to make their results more demographically representative. Because what would happen otherwise? The training data is based on data scraped from the internet, like many types of AI-based training data. And if you have data from the internet, what do all the scientists and computer science professors look like, right? So if they didn't do this, I'm sure that a Black woman would show up every once in a while, but it would very rarely show up in a group of 4 images, which is what DALL-E gives you. So why does this matter? Why is this a big enough deal that they should do something to fix this problem? I mean, I think that representation is important in the same way it is for media. And I can tell you, for example, based on my TikToks, the same people who complain about this bias mitigation technique are the same people who complain about Black elves. In terms of not thinking that representation is important. But also, this is a paper that was published earlier this year at FACT about physical robots who were trained on CLIP, which is also OpenAI. And the takeaway here is that a physical robot, when asked to, for example, choose the photo of the criminal, will enact malignant stereotypes. So here's a photo of a white man, here's a photo of a Black man. Guess which one it picks more often. And this becomes important because these kinds of robots are going to become more and more common. And they are also trained with data scraped from the web. So imagine, for example, that you have a household robot playing with a child. And the child says, I want to play dolls. Can you bring me a scientist? Or I want to play dolls. Can you bring me a parent? In the first case, you always get Ken. In the second case, you always get Barbie. These are the kinds of things that you can imagine. And this is not that far off, right? Like Harry was saying, we're not thinking about technology 100 years from now. We're thinking about like 5 years from now. And that is far enough ahead that we can think. And these are the kinds of things that have come up when I've asked students to do this Black Mirror exercise. Sometimes it's very far in the future, but not always. And regardless, this learning to do this kind of foresight is a good skill, but it does come with what I think is one really important caution. So my PhD advisee, Shamika, interviewed a lot of instructors who had used this teaching exercise in their classes. And we wrote a paper about it, and a lot of it was like, this is great, it helps people think about ethics, it helps them think about how to speculate about their own design. But also it came with what I think is a really important caution that was illustrated in part by this quote from someone who was talking about speculation in general, including user personas, which is that people tend to lean on their own experiences. So unless you're prompted, if you're doing something like imagine some user personas, a group of typical computer science students are like, my user is a middle-class white person. And I will say, I think we all know this, it is easier to imagine harms to yourself, right? It's easier for me to imagine how a technology might impact a white woman than it is for me to imagine other things. This is just how it is. And so if you're not doing this kind of thing intentionally, then this can be a big problem. We might end up with a bunch of speculation about how technology is going to harm middle-class white men. If we think about the Zoom bombing example, again, I was like, well, of course this is what's gonna happen, right? Because you know who's really good at imagining how technology might be used to harass people? People who get harassed a lot. Women, people of color, queer people. And I'm like naming off groups of people who are underrepresented in the tech industry. If you're interested in these kinds of issues, you should absolutely read Sasha Chalk's book, Design Justice. And it quotes this tweet about the social media platform Ello, which does not allow you to block people at the very beginning of it. And the tweet here is that your social media platform, if it doesn't allow you to block people, was probably developed by white dudes. Because if you're not someone who's ever experienced the things that make you need to block people on social media frequently, that might not be a concern that rises to the top, right? This problem made me think back to a book I had to read several times during my schooling. The Design of Everyday Things is sort of like the Bible for user-centered design, UX design, that sort of thing. And a few years ago, author Don Norman wrote this op-ed about how something that he saw in design today horrifies him. And he wrote this book decades ago. So what do you think it is about the world that is worse designed today than it was when the Design of Everyday Things was written? The world is not designed for the elderly. Now, do you think it is worse now than it was then? No. The world has not changed. Don Norman has changed, right? And I just think this is a good example of how we can see things more when it impacts us. And of course, this is an argument for more diversity in tech. I also think that it is not the job of people from marginalized communities to solve all of our problems for us. This should not be the only solution. I'm also not a person who believes that everyone needs to learn how to code. However, I do think that everyone needs to learn certain types of tech literacy such that we can understand enough about technology in order to critique it. Because the more people who are critiquing technology, the more types of people we have critiquing technology, the more that we can help with these kinds of issues of understanding how it can hurt different kinds of people. Because technological harms disproportionately impact marginalized people. This slide was based on a 5-minute search on Google News for algorithm. And a lot of these kinds of issues of algorithmic bias, et cetera, are explicitly impacting people from marginalized groups. Another quick example of this, if you heard about the Facebook papers, one of the stories that came out of this was information about signals in the algorithm, such that the angry reaction carries more weight than a like. And a lot of the reactions to that were like, oh, I understand what I'm seeing now. I understand a way that this technology might be manipulating me. And that's important knowledge to have. And if you know that hiring systems can be biased and why, and that facial recognition can be biased and why, this also gives you knowledge that can help you advocate for yourself. And honestly, that is why I'm on TikTok, right? Like, I'm not making TikToks about super complex concepts for the most part, but the average person doesn't necessarily know how machine learning works and how it can be biased, for example. And so just little bits of knowledge, I think, can be really important so that we're not learning everything from science fiction. Otherwise, when people hear AI ethics, they really think we're talking about killer robots. Or they think we're talking about like sentient robots, like when do robots get rights? And I think, like, let's get human rights first. And then, I mean, I'm in the sort of, I don't know that we're getting there camp myself, but way down the line, we can worry about robot rights. And I will say that something else Isaac Asimov said was that, so this was predictions he made about the future in the 80s, that technology will give us the opportunity for everyone to learn. And I think that that is true. And so I will end on another note, because I said that I'm a technology optimist, right? I am not someone who's going to tell you that AI is bad, because it's not. However, it is incredibly important for anything that is this powerful to be critiqued and scrutinized, and for us to do this kind of foresight so that it can be the best that it possibly can. So for example, an AI is keeping me alive right now. I have an insulin pump. This is like the most amazing technology, life-changing, and there are so many things that AI can do if we are able to critique it to the point that it can be the best that it can possibly be. And I will leave you with that. Thank you.
So thank you, Casey, for that amazing talk. And we're gonna have a little Q&A session between me and Casey, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So thank you so much. All right, well, that was super thought-provoking, and I love how you covered so much ground in such a short time, so I really appreciate that. That was phenomenal. One question that jumped out to me, and I think in the audience, is how do we do something about some of these technological problems when the business model is so invested in looking away, or even worse, creating these problems? So I'm reminded of the fact that, for example, Twitter makes money when outrageous and harmful things are propagated because outrageous things get more likes, and then it creates, unhappiness and a disproportionate view of the state of society. So Twitter's benefiting, but society is not. Or you talked about Facebook, and Cambridge Analytica on Facebook is really happy when more people engage and they share their data for other people to use. So can you say a little bit more about when the business model conflicts with ethics?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. Like basically part of the question here is like, what if the problem isn't really AI? What if it's capitalism? So first of all, I will say, I am not someone who thinks that like everyone who works for insert X tech company that you think is awful is evil or whatever, or doesn't care about ethics or whatever. A lot of very good friends who care a lot about this stuff, who work at companies like Meta. That said, they're usually like working on like the trust and safety team and not like advertising. And there's part of the answer here is that I think that part of what we need to be doing is supporting and also doing education around like organizing in tech and speaking to power and these kinds of things, because we're seeing more of that, and that makes me really happy. Another thing that we're seeing more of is tech companies losing talent because of their ethical reputation, which I think is non-trivial for a lot of places. An undergrad Ella did her honors thesis with me last year and interviewed graduating students in computer science about how they decide where to take a job. And people care about these kinds of things. It really does influence this. So there's also sort of a ceiling to it too. And bad PR is also non-trivial. I would like to think we could get to a point where we have enough competition as well that ethical practices become part of the business argument. Like, I have heard sort of anecdotally that a lot of people like choose to use Lyft instead of Uber because they perceive it as a more ethical company. And if we had more competition, I think we could see more of that as well. But it is a really hard problem. Seriously, a lot of this just comes down to like business models, which is challenging to deal with.
And I didn't hear in there, maybe I missed it, external regulation, like requiring?
I'm a technology optimist and a regulation pessimist.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know.
I mean, yes. So I think this is true. And maybe like, one of the examples I think of is like GDPR as a good example of something that was a forcing mechanism for data privacy. And I would like to see more of that in the US. So yes, there are times in which if people really aren't going to do the right thing, regulation is what has to force them, whether we're talking about law or if you're in like a class, like you tell people, you have to come to class and hope they're going to do the right thing, but eventually you might have to just dock them points or whatever.
No, that's a great point. And one of the things we study in law school is, when to regulate, but also when not to, or how to do it well, or
Yes.
unintended, we all laugh that the GDPR has done some great things, but it's also the Accept All Cookies Act, right?
Yeah.
We're on now accepting all cookies.
Different law.
All right, so what do you think about the validity of thinking about technologies beyond the 5-year time frame? So a lot of people engage in this, 20 years out, we're gonna be doing this, 30 years out, but we know we're notoriously unreliable as humans about doing that, and we miss new technologies that get invented, and we also have a failure of imagination about the future.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the ways that I've been thinking about this is, as I said at some point, this isn't so much about we need to teach technologists to be science fiction writers, so that or worse, regulators.
Right.
I do not want anyone writing policy based on iRobot or whatever, right? But it's more about cultivating this as a skill. Because like I said, if you can do this thinking very far in the future, you should be able to do it thinking very short term in the future. But I think that there's a risk from thinking too far out, because for one thing, I think we start to lose the plot, right? So for example, I made some social media content about the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights at OSTP release recently, and a bunch of people were like, oh, I totally thought this was going to be the Bill of Rights for the robots. And I was like, no, this is the Bill of Rights for the humans. I worry that if we start thinking too much about either Terminator or, rights for robots and that sort of thing, we will lose sight of the important things like bias and these other kinds of privacy, actual AI problems we need to be focusing on. Plus, we're not necessarily super good at predicting where technology is going to go. What is it, Merton's law, that you underestimate technology in the short term and overestimate it in the long term, or something like that, or maybe it's the other way around. But anyway, we're not good at it.
Yeah, so and just a follow-up on that, it sounds like there are some costs about disproportionately speculating about the future while missing the problems of today that are impactful but a little more mundane seeming than killer robots, which are exotic and exciting, but may or may not ever happen. And say a little bit more about your thinking there.
Yeah, I mean, I just I can't remember where I saw this. It might have even, it was either a tweet or someone's comment on my TikTok or something like that. But anyway, they were like, yeah, this is the problem with they were saying that their professional ethics class as a computer science student like it was basically killer robots.
Right.
But that's all we talked about. We talked about like killer robots, and no one ever mentioned like AI bias. And I think that is a real problem. So we need to focus on things in the short term while being able to speculate a little bit out. Right? So like, I mean, I think the example I gave of like, we need to be thinking about bias in things like GPT-3 and text to image and these kinds of things, in part because of how they might be used. Like right now, we don't have like, I don't think, well, actually, I mean, I guess the Google example, like I don't think they're using Clip, but they're using something like it. And the examples they were giving for that robot was like, oh, I just spilled something, and the robot goes and cleans it up. So it's like not outside the realm of possibility right now that you might ask it, to bring you a doll or something like that.
This is great, and I think one theme you're getting at, and I'm a big supporter of, is being very clear when technologists are in the realm of actual prediction using, methodologies that are a little more reliable, like taking technologies that we have today and imagining when they're faster, cheaper, more widespread. And you did this in your article talking about how we could have predicted Cambridge Analytica back in 2007 or earlier just based upon technologies that were there today.
Yeah.
And you just did it imagining copyright issues with, the technology versus the speculation, which is useful as maybe a thought experiment, but is not valid mode of prediction due to too much uncertainty.
Yes. And I'll also add that while we're talking like, kind of speculate, we can also imagine good things.
Right.
Right? Like we can also be doing speculation around how we want things to be. And actually that's where Shamika's research is going next, is she's going to be doing workshops with Black women about how they imagine the future. Like if you were building like the next big social media platform, what would it look like? And I think we can be imagining the good things as well. Like I spend so much of my time focused on the bad things, but part of that's because I just love all this stuff so much that I want it to be really good.
Yeah, that's right. And then final question before I open it up to the audience, and this is on the theme you just said, humans notoriously go to the worst case scenario in our imagining, like catastrophizing, but that's not necessarily the most accurate scenario. So do we want to try and get to the accurate, or is there a cost to catastrophizing, or what do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, we do tend to catastrophize. This is a thing that humans do. We do that in our personal lives too, or like imagining worst case scenarios. But sometimes when you imagine a worst case scenario, it's so that you can imagine how to not get there, right? And actually part of the Black Mirror teaching exercise is like, here's the bad thing that might happen. Now let's talk about how do we not get there? Do we need, should the technology be designed in a different way? We need to have regulation? Do we need different kinds of social norms? Like you can't stop with what's the bad thing that's gonna happen. Like you have to figure out how to fix it. Like that's the point of all of this. It isn't so that we can just sit around and be upset about, the inevitable robot apocalypse. It's so that we can imagine better futures by not doing the things that are going to get us to the bad futures.
Yes, that's a great point. I really love that. Let me throw it out to see if there are any questions from the audience. I'd love to hear from a student first, if there's any students. Yes.
I'm a student.
Bella. Yes.
Is there a way to incentivize like these kinds of technological innovations without necessarily resorting to either regulations or like trying to shame them after they have engaged in terrible conduct?
So first of all, I really do think that a lot of, especially when companies are starting out, they really want to do the right thing, right? Like I don't think this is the case of like a lot, like there are some bad people and some of them are running tech companies, but I think a lot of people really want to do the right thing. And so it's partly giving them the tools to do that. So like for example, people ask me like, oh, you teach like ethics to computer science students. So like, are you like are you making them ethical? And I'm like, I'm like, well, it's not like students come into my class and are like, I don't care about hurting people, right? It's like, if someone comes into my class and legitimately doesn't care about hurting people, I'm not gonna like get them to, right? Like, that's not gonna be the outcome. It's that people need to know how to see the harms. Like, I really think that's the biggest problem. Like, I think, like, legitimately, like, the CEO of Zoom didn't say he didn't care. He said they didn't think about it. So I think that part of, like, the more awareness that we have to all of these things, the more that people can see the potential pitfalls. So it's not a completely satisfying answer, probably, but I do think that's part of the answer.
Okay, we'll take another question. Yes.
Going back to the Zoom CEO, I can imagine that the type of people that he's been surrounded with in his tech startup are maybe not representative of the cross-section of American population. It seems like you've studied that more, you're more aware that humans do terrible things. So is there a risk if we are training our AI to curating that and saying, well, I want the scientists to have a better racial mix, I want the preschool teachers to have more males, and I'm going to curate and feed something that's not reality, and it's not going to the extent that the web scraping statistically represents reality. I'm going to feed my AI something that's not reality because I like it better that way, or I have these values and want to see that diversity. Because it seems like if the AI is predicting, you want it to have data that represents reality.
So I get this comment a lot. And I think a lot of people who talk about AI bias get this kind of comment a lot. So first of all, I think that it's okay to have a more, like, I don't think that something like an AI image generator like has to reflect, like, why does it have to reflect reality? What's the reason? So that would be part of the answer. But the other part of the answer is that, like, so statistically, like DALL-E gives you 4 images, right? Like, how many of those, if it were purely based on the what's in the internet, how many of those do you think you would have to do to get to a Black woman if you did like computer science professor, right? So what it's actually reflecting is there are no Black women computer science professors. That's what's inaccurate. And the way that DALL-E is actually working, or at least what they said in this blog post, is that they're using it to statistically represent the diversity of the world. So they're using demographic statistics. And the other thing is that, the training data, if it's like scraped from the internet, that's not reality, right? Like, the images that we have of like, Black scientists in stock photos or whatever is not reality. Like, the internet does not statistically represent the real world. So the fact that I can do that search and occasionally get a Black woman scientist is more accurate than what would happen if they didn't do that, because I've never gotten one on Midjourney.
Well, we've run out of time, but please join me in thanking Casey for an amazing